While we wait for the next generation Subaru Outback, spy photos have already been seen, let's check out the current model to answer why the best-selling Subi of all time, yes, ever in North America, is a station wagon. Yep, I said it. Now, to be honest, I've never quite understood the controversy, but Subaru generally refers to the Outback as a wagon. And if you check out their website, they even have a page going, is it an SUV or is it a wagon? And they say, hey, if you want to call it both or neither, that's just fine by them. But technically, it is a station wagon. It was designed in coordination with the Subaru Legacy, which technically has been discontinued in North America. And in Japan, it's actually known as the Legacy Outback because front doors forward, it's a Subaru Legacy. And that's actually a really good thing for the Outback, and that's why this has been so successful in my mind. Keep these dimensions in mind. It's 191.3 inches long, about the same length as the brand new 2025 Honda Passport, 2026 Honda Passport, the brand new square one. We have more ground clearance, however, 9.3 inches in the highest version of the Subaru Outback, versus 8.3 inches in that brand new Passport. But the roofline is 7 inches lower. So it's significantly easier to put bicycles, kayaks, roof tents, or whatever you want to put on top of the Outback, on top of the Outback. And that's why it should be no surprise that according to Subaru, more people do outdoorsy things in the Subaru Outback and in most of the Subaru lineup, in fact, than a lot of the competition, including Jeep competition. Because if you are the kind of person that puts your bicycle on top of your SUV or your station wagon every single day, I'm going to tell you, it's a lot easier when the roofline is 7 inches lower. Whether you're my height or you're shorter or you're taller than me, it's simply easier to get it up top. Full disclosure, not only am I a wagon fan, I have actually owned wagons before. I owned a Volvo wagon not that long ago for many of the same reasons I just mentioned. Of course, this is more of an off-road wagon, and the wagon format pays dividends here as well. The lower center of gravity means you can go on steeper slopes without worrying so much about tipping your vehicle over. And that center of gravity is doubly lower in a wagon like this because of the boxer engine designs. Not only do we have the general format of wagon pushing that center of gravity down, the boxer engine design pushes it even lower. We'll take a look at that in a moment. Another reason to get the Outback and another reason for its success is that the base MSRP is right in line with a lot of compact crossovers or SUVs, but you get a lot more room on the inside. Now, Subaru still has a budget that has to be adhered to, so while we find full LED headlights, we don't have complete LED modules. The turn signals, those are incandescents, but the optional fog lights below, those are LEDs as well. And basically those same compromises play out back here where we find combination taillight modules with LED brake lights, incandescent turn signals, and of course a lot of black body cladding all the way around. Now, if you really want to go further off the beaten path, you might want to check out an SUV with actual skid plates. The Wilderness version of the Outback, we're not taking a look at that today. That does have some underbody protection, but not the same kind of underbody protection that you'd find in a Bronco Sport or a Bronco or a Wrangler, etc. These silver panels here, these are just painted plastic body panels. As always, there are pros and cons to various body shapes. When we're talking about an off-road wagon like the Outback, there's a big advantage if you're a shorter person or you have mobility issues, and that's the ease of getting in and out, even though, again, you can have up to 9.5 inches of ground clearance. And that's because the seating position is much more sedan-like. You'll notice that my legs are stretched out much further in front of me than in a Honda Passport, talking about the new one, of course, and the roofline is certainly lower. That's because the box on top is just not as square. It's more of that station wagon format. So if you like the more relaxed, more reclined driving position, more of a lounge style position, I guess you'd say, rather than that upright van or truck-like position, you might want to get something like this. As far as actual roominess numbers go, this is pretty similar, however, because with this seat all the way down there on the ground, I have maybe about 1.5 or 2 inches of headroom left, and if you didn't get the moonroof, you'd get a little bit more room up front. This driver's seat has a 4-way adjustable lumbar support, but you should know that even in this top-end trim, the passenger seat doesn't have the same range of motion. We do, however, have a tilt telescopic steering column with a reasonable range of motion itself. The long body and long wheelbase allows the Outback to have notably more legroom than the average compact crossover, especially like a RAV4. You'll certainly notice that with the front seat adjusted for me in a more relaxed position, I still have quite a lot of legroom left. And even if I move over here, Where this seat is all the way back in its tracks, you can see I still have about 1.5 inches of legroom, and we have a slightly wider back seat than we find in the average compact crossover. On the downside, headroom is a little bit more limited than some, but it's actually pretty darn close to that new Passport. If you get the optional moonroof, however, it feels more constricted because the moonroof is one of the kind that pops into the ceiling and then rolls back, and it has to have a track, a place for that to go. So the ceiling in this area is about 2 inches lower than it is right above my head. The Outback really shines when it comes to accommodating child seats because the critical dimension, especially for rear-facing child seats like this, is not the traditional legroom figure. Remember how legroom is measured. It basically goes from your hip point to your knee and then down there to the floor. Instead, rear seat back to the back of the front seat back is the most critical dimension, and thanks to the long and low profile of the Outback, we actually get more room for rear-facing infant seats or rear-facing convertible seats. The difference is especially obvious when you consider similarly priced rather than similarly sized vehicles like a RAV4 or a CR-V. This certainly has more room in the back seat than you find in a RAV4, again, especially for those larger child seats. As far as the anchor situation goes, Subaru does something that we find in a few select alternatives, and that is an extra latch anchor for the center seat position. You'll find it right here under the same sort of Velcro flap that covers the outboard latch anchors. Now, there's one obvious problem. It's not a complete second set, so you would use this anchor, and in the process, you would end up covering up the outboard latch for the regular shoulder belt. So if you are planning on putting a child seat in the center, I might recommend, if you have a narrower seat, actually using the center seat belt because it is going to more properly align. However, Subaru does put that center shoulder belt in the ceiling, and that means that your seat may not exactly be in the center of this center area. Also, if you are planning on using those latch anchors for a base station like this Collect base station with an anti-rebound leg, keep in mind that leg is not going to be centered on the footwell or on the transmission hump, so it's not going to really be possible to use that feature. So what about cargo capacity? Well, that is definitely a downside to the Wagon format because versus that brand new Passport with the really boxy style, we have about 12 cubic feet less cargo capacity back here. 32.5 cubic feet versus 44 in that Passport. Both vehicles have a spare tire, but in the Passport you actually have a bit more storage space under the load floor that's not included in that 44 cubic foot total. However, luggage-wise, it's not too far off. It's just that if you're putting luggage above the rear seat backs, you'll get more room in the Passport, but below the rear seat backs, it's actually pretty consistent with what we find in the Outback. And that's how in our 24-inch roller bag test, sorry for throwing bags everywhere, as you can see, we were able to squeeze 7 of these 24-inch roller bags back here. That is significantly better than the average compact vehicle, even though the cargo area figures may look quite similar. And the reason for that is the length of the cargo area. It's quite a bit longer from the back of those rear seats all the way here to the cargo opening, again, thanks to that stretched format. Now, some of you might be thinking, how is that possible? Well, there's the length of the Outback to consider, and then there's the distance between the firewall and the very front of the vehicle, which is actually a little bit shorter than average. And that's because we have relatively short engines. Things start out with a 2.5-liter boxer engine shared with a wide variety of different Subarus. That makes 182 horsepower, 176 pound-feet of torque. Then we have basically the same 2.4-liter turbocharged boxer that the bigger 3-row Ascent has. 260, 277 in this particular trim. If you get the optional turbo engine, towing will go up from 2,700 pounds to 3,500 pounds when properly equipped. But of course, fuel economy will go down. The base engine averages 28 miles per gallon. This one is rated for 25 miles per gallon, and if you get the more off-road capable wilderness trim, it drops further down to 23 miles per gallon. For 2025, there are a ton of different Outback trims, no less than 9 to choose from. Now, the reason the Outback Wilderness gets lower fuel economy than this model is because it gets a different final drive ratio, and that's also why it's a little bit quicker 0 to 60. Instead of the 4.1 to 1 ratio we find in this model, it gets a more aggressive 4.44 to 1, giving you better off-road capability, especially in low-speed maneuvers when you need a lot of torque, and of course, 0 to 60 runs. If you're considering an Outback as an alternative to a RAV4 or another small SUV, there are a few things to keep in mind. The base version isn't going to look quite like this on the inside. It has a single-zone automatic climate control system and a twin 7-inch LCD in the dashboard, running a relatively similar version of the software rather than this big single-screen LCD that you find here. We still have physical buttons on either side, and of course it supports Apple CarPlay right there in the center. It's wireless only. There's no method for USB CarPlay, although we do have some USB ports down there if you want to do that. The interior materials inside this cabin are definitely more premium than the average small SUV, but keep in mind this is basically the top-end touring trim, so some of the features and functions in here are clearly not found in the base model. For instance, the base model has only a 4-speaker audio system. Now, we don't know what the refreshed Outback is going to look like, but I'm going to guess it's probably going to get the full LCD cluster that we saw in that WRX we just reviewed, but here we have this combination analog display with a small color LCD in the middle of it. We have the typical Subaru steering wheel, paddle shifters on the back, even though we do have a CVT under the hood. I kind of find those a little bit silly. They're kind of as useful as paddle shifters on a Poodle as far as I'm concerned, but we do have a heated steering wheel toggle right there, heated and ventilated seats in this model. Decent amount of soft touch materials all over the dashboard, like the soft touched stitched materials there. Places to put your smartphone include that little slot right there, as well as a little slot right there in front of the shifter, right by those USB ports, but it is a little bit tricky for some of those larger smartphones. We have a console shifter there, a reasonable amount of shiny black plastic. I am concerned about scratches long term there. We then have two really big cup holders. Those are easily able to accommodate large takeout drinks, and if I take that little coffee thing out of there, you'll see how we do that. You can remove these little rubber plugs so that way your drinks aren't lost down there in those really deep cup holders, because they're very big and they're very, very deep as well. We have a padded center armrest there that opens to reveal a smaller storage cubby than we find in many vehicles because, of course, there's a transmission under there. This uses a longitudinal transmission design rather than a transverse transmission like we find in most of the competition. Moving over to the seats and the door panel, you can see this has the optional brown leather, pretty decent bolsters on the side, they're not adjustable, and a reasonable amount of soft touch materials on the door. So soft touch upper and mid sections, soft touch armrest, and then harder plastics down there around that bottle holder. Moving up to the ceiling, we find slide to the side sun visors for the driver and front passenger, a pretty standard size moonroof just over my head and the front passenger's heads, and then we get height adjustable shoulder belts and 4-way ratchet style headrests for the driver and front passenger. The first thing we should do is talk about Subaru's all-wheel drive system. In some circles, Subaru fans say things like, oh, it can go anywhere a Grand Cherokee could go. That's really not true. We do have a lot of ground clearance and we have a very capable all-wheel drive system, but this is not that next level in four-wheel drive capability. It doesn't have lockers or limited slips. It doesn't have a low ratio mode, but it does have excellent all-wheel drive software. And that's the big thing when we take a look at this, especially versus something like maybe a Jeep Compass or any of those front-wheel drive based Jeeps. The software situation is actually pretty similar. So instead of simply cutting power like we find in so many competitive crossovers or SUVs, Subaru tries their best to direct power around the wheels first. We also have excellent dimensions in this. And the most important dimension, especially for this trail, is ground clearance. So when we're talking about these sticks and branches, etc., that have fallen in a recent windstorm, or the fact that there's some really heavily rutted sections of this trail, it's absolutely not a problem for the Outback, and it would be for something like a Crown Signia. The Crown Signia, it comes across as the luxury hybrid Outback in a way, but it has significantly less off-road capability because of its E-axle in the back. And that's why when we see a next generation Outback, which is likely going to have a hybrid, it's not going to have that kind of hybrid system. It's probably going to have the one that Subaru recently debuted in Japan, where it has basically this exact same mechanical all-wheel drive system with a next generation version of their hybrid system that we found in the plug-in hybrid Crosstrek not that long ago. Now again, the big thing here is the confidence-inspiring feel. This is not the off-road wilderness model. This is the one with the regular all-season tires on it, but lots of good traction is happening here. Right now we're in the X mode, and you'll really notice that if I floor it, that yeah, there's wheel slip, but the software does a good job of directing that power and where the torque is going. Also, thanks to the ground clearance, you can just bomb up these trails without really worrying, except of course when we get to a big stick like that. And that's the benefit of the suspension tune, the ground clearance, and just the design of the Outback generally. And that's why I've always commented that it seems like the Outback is targeted exactly at my demographic, because I live 2 miles down a gravel road. In order to get to the paved road, I have to drive on this exact road every single day. And this is really comfortable on a road like this because we have the ground clearance, we have that off-road mission, which means we have softer springs, and all of that is possible because of the wagon-like format that we get in the Outback. That lower center of gravity, the lighter curb weight, etc. that we find here versus especially something like a Grand Cherokee means that the suspension can be more compliant. And even though there are always compromises with every suspension design, there are fewer compromises required when you have a low center of gravity and you have a relatively light curb weight. Things that we don't find in the rock crawling competition because they need even stronger bodies, they need more durable components, etc. to be able to tackle Moab. And that's the big difference between the Outback and something like the Grand Cherokee. Although when it comes to ride quality, they're relatively similar because you can get the Grand Cherokee with an adaptive air suspension, as I mentioned before. You just get that same sort of ride quality without the expense of those more expensive components. And that's certainly why I'm going to give ride quality an A+. And I think that's also why Outbacks have been so popular in the West Coast, especially the Pacific Northwest. If you live in a rural area or you frequently go to rural areas and you're worried about, what happens in a windstorm if there's a branch in the road, will I clear it? The Outback, absolutely yes, unless of course it's a really big branch and then you're going to need to cut that up. Also, we have a very maneuverable vehicle. The turning radius in here is relatively small, significantly smaller than the Grenadier Long-Term that we have at the moment, and certainly smaller than some big Jeeps as well. And of course, once you get to the paved road, you have something that drives more like a car. 0 to 60 in this model happened in 6.2 seconds. If you get the Wilderness trim, it's a little bit faster. If you get the base engine, keep in mind, it's not going to be terribly swift. 8.6 seconds is what we scored in that model the last time we tested it. That's right in line with something like a Nissan Rogue or the base version of the RAV4. This is significantly quicker, and if I were shopping for an Outback, the turbo is certainly the way that I would go. Of course, keep in mind, it is still going to have Subaru's CVT. It's not my favorite CVT, but it does the job, and it imitates gear shifts if that's something you're interested in. So you can flap the paddles here, you can get second gear, third gear. The shifts are a lot slower and kind of mushy compared to the average automatic transmission, but it does do it, and it is handy in mountainous areas because you can really control your speed downhill. It does a good job of that, actually better than most turbocharged small engines. Now, when it comes to the braking score, keep in mind we don't have the widest tires on this model. So it took 120 feet for this to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. If you're debating between the Wilderness trim and the non-Wilderness trims of Outback, keep in mind that all-terrain tires generally don't perform as well on regular road surfaces, and that's why in the Wilderness trim we recently tested, it took 131 feet to stop from 60 back to 0. So there are some payoffs and some compromises required when we're talking about that comparison. Handling ability, actually still pretty good, even though we do have those narrower tires. And you can thank the lower center of gravity and again the lighter curb weight. This is the kind of vehicle where even though maybe road holding G's, it's not going to pull quite as many as some, it's going to feel better than most. We have that low center of gravity. Yes, we have the relatively soft springs, but we don't have excessive amounts of body roll or excessive amounts of tip and dive compared to something like the previous generation Passport. We've been talking a lot about the new big boxy Passport. We haven't driven that one yet, so stay tuned for that. But I can say that versus the previous generation Passport Trail Sport, this is significantly more comfortable out on a wide variety of trails. The Passport, thanks to its limited slip functionality for its rear axle and its ability to send more power to the rear axle, can be more off-road capable in some situations than an Outback. But remember, we have lots of ground clearance here. This is lighter, and this is a whole lot more comfortable when you're out on roads like we were just on, or trails like we were just on. On the other hand, the Passport currently on sale has a very firm suspension tune, so if you plan on going down that trail at the national park and it's an hour-long trail, keep in mind your kidneys are going to get bruised and they're not going to be in the Outback. This is significantly more suitable for that kind of off-road capability. When it comes to cabin noise, we also got a pretty decent score in here, 72 decibels. That's about average for most of the mid-size or compact crossover competition. Not too far off where we find the Passport. Fuel economy though, that's pretty decent, especially considering the power that we have in this model. We've been averaging 25.2 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving. This is going to be a little bit below the regular engine, but if you treat it gently, you actually won't get too far off in terms of fuel economy, especially on those longer road trips. One of the big advantages for the Outback is highway fuel economy because we have that lower roof line, so you get better efficiency, better aerodynamics out on the road, even though we have that higher ground clearance. Not everybody is a fan of CVTs, I definitely understand that, but that is also one of the reasons that the Outback gets the fuel economy that it does. This all-wheel drive system is also tuned to send more power to the front wheels when you're not needing power in the back. Again, the software is pretty decent. You have to engage X mode if you want better capability, and we get the more advanced X mode system if you're in the wilderness trim. Just keep in mind, this is a brake-based system. So it's gonna close the clutch pack to try and send power to the rear, and then it's gonna use the brakes to direct power around the vehicle. That's definitely capable enough for sand, for snow, for road surfaces like this, mild off-road trails. But if you, again, do plan on taking your Outback further off the beaten path where you're really going to be worried about underbody protection, rock rails, things like that, then you are going to want the next level in terms of all-wheel drive capability. We all know there's a new Subaru Outback coming. We have all seen the spy photos, and it's looking like it's going to be, well, less Outback-y than ever before. But for now, let's put that aside, talk about it at the end, and dive into pricing. Because one thing I hope that does not change with the new Outback is its pricing scheme. Starting at $30,315, going on up to $44,215, including the $1,420 destination charge, you can see that the Outback's pricing ladder is really unusual. It doesn't exactly fit in the compact, crossover, or SUV segment, nor does it really fit in the midsize crossover or SUV segment. Most outlets, most people seem to want to put it in the midsize segment, but it really is this unusual wagony SUV crossover-y. What is this thing? I don't know. But pricing ladder-wise, it's right on top of the Subaru Forester. And that makes a lot of sense because capability-wise, it's very, very similar to the Forester. It just has to do with what kind of format do you like. Do you like that more boxy and upright sitting position? Do you prefer the more relaxed, more reclined, sedan-like seating position, etc.? It's also right on top of a RAV4. And that is one big reason to get this over some of those competitors out there. But you'll notice it's actually not right on top of the Crown Signia. Comparisons as a result are kind of tricky, but we should first talk more in depth about that Forester. The Forester is newer. It doesn't have the optional turbo, which you can get in the Outback. I would say handling-wise, it's actually pretty similar. The Outback comes across as a little bit softer tuned, has a lot more body roll, a little bit more tip and dive than we find in the Forester, and that does affect the handling ability, but it's not a huge deal. Both have relatively low centers of gravity. The Forester, though, is definitely more regular SUV. If you want that boxier profile to put bigger, boxier things in the back, if you have taller passengers in the rear, if you don't mind lifting those heavier loads onto the roof a little bit higher off the ground, it's going to be a great option. But at their core, they're not as far removed as you might think, because even though the Forester has the latest interpretation of Subaru's infotainment and electronic systems, it's basically the same generation that was debuted first on the Outback. Now, we know that we're going to get full LCD instrument clusters soon in some various different Subaru models, but we don't know whether it's going to come first in the Forester or in the redesigned Outback whenever that comes online. We also know that we're going to get a hybrid system in the Forester, but we pretty much know that we're probably going to get a hybrid system in the Outback as well. Really, it's just going to depend on your format. Do you like the sausage in longer format, or do you like the taller one? Basically, same sausage, different dimensions. That's all they did here. So, exactly the same ingredients poured out into a different mold. The Crown Signia, though, that kind of looks like an Outback, but it's really not when you start scratching the surface. Is it suspicious that Toyota owns 20% of Subaru and they decided not to price the Crown Signia right on top and have no overlap? I don't know. Actually, that's just a conspiracy theory there, because you can expect there's going to be plenty of overlap when we get the new Outback and we get the addition of the hybrid Outback in the lineup. I would actually expect there to be quite a lot of overlap. At the moment, though, the Crown Signia starts at $44,985, goes on up to $52,000 approximately, so quite a big spread. But there's more than just the pricing, and more than just the luxurious feel that you would expect with that pricing increase. The Crown Signia is not really targeted at the same off-road community. It certainly has the practicality of the low roofline and easy to put kayaks and things up there, but you're not going to go further off the beaten path in it. We get much less ground clearance, less protection under there. We don't have an all-wheel drive system that's nearly as capable because it's hybrid only, and it uses the e-all-wheel drive system that we have seen in other Toyota models for some time. Toyota was really specific that they didn't see themselves targeting the Outback so much with the Crown Signia, even though it kind of looks like one, and that's because the price point's different, it's not as off-road capable, etc. However, the big deal is that it is certainly more efficient. On the other hand, I think the Crown Signia is a slightly better comparison than our next competitor, which has to be the Chevy Blazer, and in a way this is the stand-in for a bunch of mid-sized SUVs that we could be talking about. The pricing is pretty similar, especially when you factor in the average discount on something like a Murano or on the Chevy Blazer. But here, it's basically the same thing as the Forester. We get a taller box, but we get pretty similar length to the Outback. So you do get that long interior, but you get a bit taller box on top, and you're going to have to pay extra for that, especially if we're talking about the Honda Passport or the Volkswagen Atlas Cross Sport, or, of course, something like a Jeep Grand Cherokee. I know a lot of Subaru customers want the Outback to be compared against the Grand Cherokee. They're very, very different vehicles at their core. And that's really the bottom line for the Subaru, is that Subaru has created this interesting niche product that is not so niche anymore because it's one of Subaru's best-selling vehicles and has really accounted for Subaru's enormous growth in North America. But very few car companies have tried to directly copy it. And even with the advent of the Crown Signia, Toyota's not bothering to really try and copy it either. They could very easily have given us a TRD Pro something, and they could have jacked it up further, given us 4 extra inches of ground clearance, a real all-wheel drive system, etc. They chose not to do that. Very similarly, if we take a look at the luxury Outbacks out there, essentially, the Volvo Cross Countries, the All-Roads, the Mercedes E-Class, etc., they're somewhat of the same formula as the Outback, but significantly more expensive, and as a result, just not the same kind of demographic. Let me know what you think about that down there, and what do you think the new Outback is going to be like? Do you think it's going to alienate Subaru customers? Because there's no longer a legacy to base an Outback off of. And this is going to give Subaru maybe more freedom to create something different, something unique, while at the same time, there's a danger, I would say, that Subaru might not recreate what Subaru customers have come to love. That definite station wagon-y vibe and the practicality that comes with that and the on-road driving dynamics that come with that. Of course, it's too early to say because we haven't seen it yet. We will be seeing it over the next few months since those spy shots are already out there, so stay tuned. It may debut in early 2025. We'll keep you all posted. In the meantime, go ahead and sound off down there in that comment section. And if you want to sound off on reliability, which I think is a great topic to sound off here, since we have a variety of different things you could compare the Outback to, you can also send us a voicemail. Call 669-842-1947. You can leave us a voicemail there. You can also send us voice memos to hey@autobuyersguide.com. And your voice memos and your voicemails will be included in future episodes where we're going to be talking about reliability. What does that mean to people? What are your reliability stories that you might want to share? All of that is coming up in probably a podcast first, and then more of a digested episode at some point later. See you next time.